Now, what if we wanted to do the opposite of turning up the sustain? What if we wanted there to be kind of like less sustain in the sound, right? We could do that. Let's try it on maybe this track. It's this nice little kind of like arpeggiated kind of melody line, right? Our compressor device on here, just gonna minimize the echo for now. So that echo is on a really, really short delay time, and it's just adding a little bit of extra kind of sustain to the sound, basically. It's the main thing that it's doing. So we have our third mode in the sort of peak detection section, which is the expand mode. And we're no longer doing compression here. We're now actually doing something called expansion, right? And what expansion does is, again, you have your threshold volume level, and as you turn the threshold down, it's actually making the volume get louder as it gets past the threshold that we set, right? And as you turn the ratio up, it sort of increases this sort of change in loudness so that now basically we have a 1-to-2 ratio right here instead of a 2-to-1 ratio, meaning that once it gets past this threshold, then it's going to be twice as loud as it normally would be, right? Let's set that knee to 0 again real quick. And so now what you'll kind of notice is gain reduction gainer is now going in the opposite direction. Our sound is overall a little bit louder, but it's a little bit spiky, right? Transients are a little bit more pronounced, right? Now, if I turn off the makeup, that actually reduces the volume. Because our threshold is down here at -20, but our ratio is 1-to-2 instead of 2-to-1, meaning that the compressor device is actually adding extra volume with its algorithm, with the sort of actual expansion that we're doing, meaning the makeup control needs to decrease the volume in order to sort of get it to kind of like an automatic similar volume level, right? I'm going to turn that back off, but I am going to maybe do some output gain reduction here. Go to like -3 or 4. Now let's listen to even less gain down there. You hear how it's having the effect of accentuating our transients instead of kind of de-accentuating the transient, right? So we're actually increasing the dynamic range of our sound instead of decreasing the dynamic range of the sound.
Is that something you can use if you say have like an overcompressed sample to make it sound less compressed, or is it at that point the kind of damage done? It's really not going to help.
You can try to make a overcompressed sound a little bit less compressed with a expander. Let's give it a shot. Let's go back to maybe our drums, and I'm going to turn off this one. I'm going to minimize it, and then let's change the settings on this compressor so that it sounds like pretty overcompressed instead of. So we have like a pretty intensely kind of overcompressed sound there. Let's go ahead and throw an expander after this and see just what happens. Okay. Ratio up a bit. A little bit, right? We can kind of, I'm going to just go ahead and group these real quick. We can just turn them off and on all at the same time. So here's with overcompression and a bunch of expansion to kind of make it up for it. There's the original sound. So they certainly have a different kind of character to them. So as we can kind of hear, the expander helped for sure, right? It didn't kind of like perfectly correct our overcompressed sound, I would say. We still have a lot sort of like less overall dynamic range because the sort of compressor settings that we were able to create with this compressor were a little bit sort of too much for the expander to kind of like make up for, right? But if you have sort of a really, really overcompressed sample, let me see if I can find one in here real quick. You go to like loop and then kind of like a drum loop, and then know that this E is like pretty kind of compressed. Here we go. This is a super, super squashed sample, right? So let's take this, grab our compressor, and I'm just going to go ahead and immediately turn our output volume, or sort of the clip volume, down a bunch. Here, right? We'll go to like neg 7 or something. I'll pause that. So if we listen to this, span mode. Able to a little bit breathe some extra dynamic range. And again, what we're kind of doing there, if you think about it, is we're doing something called transient shaping. Right? Where if you find a transient shaper plugin, a lot of the time, what you'll find is what it's actually doing to sort of accentuate transients is it's doing expansion. And then a lot of the time, what it's doing to sort of de-accentuate and sort of de-emphasize transients is it's actually doing compression, right? But a lot of time to sort of de-emphasize transients, it won't just be doing downward compression, it'll also maybe be doing some upward compression too. So it'll take these sort of quietest parts of our sound and turn them up to be a little bit louder, right? I'm going to show a quick example of doing that on this track right here, which is these super, super short. I'm going to make them even shorter, kind of spiky little sounds that I've made as kind of like a just background soundtrack for this track, right? So let's grab the multi-band dynamics effect, and I'm going to turn off the low and the high bands. So all we're focused on is the mid band right now, right? So it's just sort of a single band dynamics effect. All right. And so what we can do is we can focus on this below section instead of this above section, right? So the compressor device basically only has an above section. It has a threshold where if volume gets past that threshold, then something happens, right? But the multiband dynamics effect also has a section where if volume gets below this threshold, then something will happen, right? So let's go ahead and just play our sound through this, and we can see we have kind of a spot where the volume is going to be crossing a threshold a bunch of different times, right? It's either lower than there or higher than there, kind of depending on what's going on, right? And now what we can do is we can use a ratio control here to either do expansion or compression of the volume of all of the sounds that are below that threshold of -35, right? So if we turn this down, what we're doing is we're actually doing downward expansion, which is kind of increasing the overall dynamic range, right? So every time it gets below this threshold, it's actually making it quieter. Or we turn our ratio up. Maybe we could do like an infinity to 1 or like sort of maybe like a 8-to-1 ratio. And now we turn this threshold down a bit, you'll notice everything below is just sort of getting an increase in volume, but if we turn it up here, right, you hear how the kind of low end of that sound is being brought out because it's the sort of like really kind of like the part of the sound that's sort of in the kind of like tail end of it, and it's actually making the whole sound overall have kind of like a longer kind of envelope time and kind of like overall sort of like de-emphasizing the transients a bit. The other thing that we can do is we can use a upward compressor to squash everything above. And now our transients have been really de-emphasized at time, right? So we're using both downward compression and upward compression to both squeeze all of the quieter parts of the sound to be a bit louder and squeeze all of the loudest parts of the sounds to be a bit quieter.